"I never had a wife," said the lonely mountain man when two abandoned widows begged for shelter. Elias had lived all his life in the mountains, far away from the hustle and noise of the villages below. His cabin sat on the edge of a steep slope, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently with the wind. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of snow in winter and the fragrance of wildflowers in spring. He liked it that way, quiet, untouched, and calm. People in the village often whispered about him. Some said he was lonely, others called him strange, but Elias paid little attention. He had built a life of solitude, and in many ways he liked it that way. From the outside, his life looked simple, almost too simple to outsiders. But there was a rhythm to it that suited him perfectly. Each morning he woke at dawn. The first thing he did was step outside his cabin, breathe in the cold, fresh air, and listen to the sounds of the forest waking up. Birds chirped from the trees, a small stream gurgled nearby, and sometimes, if the wind was just right, he could hear the faint sound of children laughing far below in the village. He never tired of these small things. To him they were proof that life went on, even in the quietest corners of the world. Elias spent most of his time tending to his small vegetable garden and chopping wood for the stove that kept his cabin warm through the harsh winters. His cabin was modest, built from logs he had cut and shaped himself when he was a young man. Inside there were simple furnishings, a sturdy wooden table, a few chairs, a small bed covered with a thick quilt, and shelves lined with books he had collected over the years. The walls were decorated with photographs of mountains and forests, places he had visited in his youth. There were no mirrors, no fancy ornaments, and no signs of any family or visitors. Everything reflected a life chosen for its simplicity and calm. Evenings were Elias's favorite time. After finishing his chores, he would light the old iron stove and sit by it with a cup of warm tea. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the wooden walls. He liked to read old journals and books, some written by travelers who had wandered through the mountains long ago, others by writers who wrote about life in quiet, reflective ways. Sometimes he read stories of people who had loved and lost, and though he never had a wife himself, he felt a strange connection to their emotions. There was a certain comfort in knowing that loneliness and longing were not entirely his alone. Elias rarely visited the village. Only when it was absolutely necessary would he make the long trek down the mountain. He avoided markets, festivals, and gatherings. The villagers were friendly enough, polite when he appeared, but he never stayed long. Children would wave at him from afar, curious about the tall, silent man in the mountains. Some adults would try to invite him for meals or celebrations, but he always had an excuse ready: work to do, weather to watch, or simply a preference for solitude. And so he remained a figure of mystery, a man who seemed content with his quiet, lonely life. People often asked Elias why he had never married. Some villagers whispered that perhaps he had loved someone once and lost her. Others thought he was simply too proud or too different to share his life with anyone. The truth was simpler. He had never met anyone who felt like home to him. He had known joy in many forms, reading a book under the shade of a tree, walking through the forest at dawn, feeling the wind brush against his face. But love, the kind that tied two lives together, had never been a part of his story, and over the years he had grown comfortable with that absence. It was not sadness that filled him, it was peace. Yet, despite his self-imposed solitude, Elias was not lonely in the way some might think. He had the mountains for company, and he spoke to them in his mind, describing what he did each day, imagining them listening. Sometimes he sang quietly to himself while chopping wood or tending his garden. The birds seemed to answer him in their own way, and the trees swayed as though in rhythm with his voice. The stars at night were his friends, bright points of light he admired as he sat outside and thought about the world. He understood that people might see this as strange, but he did not mind. He had made peace with his life, and he cherished the freedom it gave him. Elias also had a keen sense of the seasons. Spring brought a burst of life to the mountain. Green leaves unfurled, flowers bloomed, and the snow melted to feed the streams. Summer was warm and long, filled with the hum of bees and the rustle of animals moving through the forest. Autumn painted the trees in gold and red, and the crisp air reminded him of the coming winter. Winter, harsh and cold, blanketed everything in white. It was during winter that his solitude felt most profound. The world slowed down, the villagers stayed indoors, and even the animals seemed quieter. He would spend long hours by the fire, writing notes in his journals, planning for the next season, and reflecting on the life he had built. Despite all the calm and beauty, there was a part of Elias that sometimes wondered what it might be like to share his life with someone else. Not often, and not with longing that hurt, but with curiosity. What would it be like to have someone speak to him in the evening? To share a meal, a laugh, or a story? To feel the warmth of another person by the fire on a cold night? These thoughts were fleeting, often pushed aside by his practical nature and his belief that he was better off alone. Still, they existed quietly in the back of his mind, like tiny seeds waiting for a rare season to bloom. Elias's life had a steady rhythm, and he liked it that way. He enjoyed the simplicity, the clarity, and the connection with the world around him. He knew that most people could not understand it. The quiet, the patience, the satisfaction in small accomplishments. But that did not matter. Life, for him, was not about what others thought. It was about living fully in the space he had chosen. And so he continued day by day, chopping wood, tending his garden, reading, and observing the mountains. He never hurried, never worried excessively, and never looked back with regret. Little did Elias know that life, as calm and steady as it had been, was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. A storm was approaching not just from the skies above, but from the paths below, and it would bring with it two strangers, two women who would ask for something he had never given before, not just shelter, but a place in his carefully ordered, solitary world. For Elias, this was something he had never considered, and yet the mountain had a way of showing that even the most solitary hearts might have room for unexpected companionship. As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Elias stood outside his cabin, looking over the forest. He inhaled the cool air, feeling the calm settle around him. He had no idea that tomorrow would bring visitors who would knock on his door, testing his solitude and his quiet strength. And though he did not know it yet, the story of Elias, the mountain man who never had a wife, was about to enter a new chapter, one filled with challenges, warmth, and perhaps a kind of connection he had only imagined in quiet moments by the fire. The night had fallen on the mountains, and the wind whispered through the pine trees like a soft song. Elias sat by the fire, sipping his warm tea, his mind wandering through the quiet memories of the day. The forest outside was alive with faint sounds, the rustle of small animals, the creaking of branches, and the distant call of an owl. Everything was as it should be, peaceful, predictable, and undisturbed. Yet, high above the village, the calm night hid an approaching storm, not just of wind and snow, but of unexpected visitors who would soon arrive at Elias's door. It began as a faint sound, almost lost in the howl of the wind. At first Elias thought it was the branches brushing against the cabin, but then he heard it again, a soft knock, tentative and uneven. He set down his cup and frowned, unsure if he should investigate. Visitors were rare, almost unheard of at this height. Whoever they were, it was unusual for them to be wandering the mountain paths at night. Slowly, he pushed open the wooden door, and the cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and rain. Standing there, shivering and soaked, were two women. Their clothes were drenched, their hair plastered to their faces by the rain. Their eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, and their voices trembled as they spoke. "Please, we need shelter." "Just for the night," one of them whispered, her hands wrapped tightly around herself to keep warm. The other clutched a small bundle close to her chest. Elias studied them carefully. They looked fragile, tired from a long journey, and clearly had nowhere else to turn. For a long moment Elias said nothing. His first instinct was to close the door and return to his fire. He liked his solitude, and strangers brought complications. Yet something in the way the women looked at him, so desperate, so vulnerable, stirred a feeling he had long ignored. Compassion, long buried under years of quiet independence, rose slowly in his chest. Finally, he nodded. "Come in," he said simply. "You can stay for the night, but don't expect comfort. I live a simple life." The women's faces lit up with relief. They thanked him softly, their voices almost blending with the sound of the rain outside. As they stepped inside, Elias closed the door behind them and motioned toward the small area near the stove. Sit there. I'll make some tea," he said. The cabin, warm from the fire, smelled of wood smoke and earth, a scent that was both comforting and foreign to the women. They shivered less now, grateful for the warmth. As Elias prepared tea, he watched them quietly. One of the women, the taller one with dark hair, looked around the cabin with wide eyes, as if taking in every detail of his solitary life. The other, smaller and more delicate, seemed lost in thought, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the bundle. Elias did not ask their names yet. He wanted to know them slowly, carefully. There was a rhythm to his life, and he did not want to upset it too quickly. Finally, he handed them each a steaming cup of tea. They sipped it gratefully, the warmth spreading through their cold bodies. "Thank you," the taller woman said softly. "We were so afraid we wouldn't find shelter before the storm." Elias nodded but did not speak. Words were unnecessary for now. Silence, he knew, could be as comforting as speech, especially in moments of exhaustion and fear. The women settled near the fire, their bodies hunched to conserve heat. Elias returned to his chair across from them, continuing to sip his own tea. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire. Outside, the storm grew stronger, snow beginning to fall in thick flakes, turning the mountain paths into a slippery, dangerous maze. Elias felt a strange sense of protection stir in him. These women were strangers, yet here in his domain he felt responsible for their safety. As the night wore on, he began to ask small questions. "Where are you from?" he asked gently. The taller woman, whose name was Martha, explained that they were both from a nearby village, but had been forced to leave due to circumstances beyond their control. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the strength of someone who had endured hardship. The smaller woman, Clara, remained quiet, only nodding occasionally, her eyes focused on the fire. Elias listened, nodding slowly. He did not judge them. He had long ago learned that life was full of unexpected hardships, and sometimes people needed help simply because the world could be cruel. The hours passed slowly. The storm outside intensified, whipping the trees and rattling the cabin. Elias moved about, checking that the fire was strong, that the tea would last, and that the women were comfortable. He offered them blankets from his small collection, showing a gentleness that surprised even himself. For the first time in years, his solitary life felt interrupted in a way that was not unpleasant. The women's presence brought a warmth, a liveliness, that the cabin had never known before. As they sat together, a quiet trust began to form. Martha spoke of her late husband, a kind man who had always dreamed of traveling the mountains, but had passed away suddenly. Clara's story was shorter, filled with loss and the fear of being alone in the world. Elias did not respond with pity. Instead, he shared small fragments of his own life, the routines he followed, the seasons he cherished, and the joy he found in solitude. The women listened, fascinated by the calmness that came from a life lived in harmony with nature. Despite the comfort, there were moments of tension. The women were not used to such bare surroundings, and the cabin seemed almost too small for 3 people. Martha accidentally knocked over a small stack of books, and Elias sighed quietly, not with anger, but with a hint of frustration at the disruption to his carefully ordered world. Yet, even in these moments, a bond was forming. They were learning each other's habits, discovering the rhythms of life that could coexist, even in such close quarters. By midnight, the storm had reached its peak. Snow piled against the windows, the wind howling as if it were testing the endurance of the cabin. Elias checked the fire one last time before returning to his chair. The women were asleep near the stove, wrapped in blankets. For a moment, he watched them, feeling a strange mixture of responsibility, curiosity, and something he had never acknowledged. The beginning of a connection. They were strangers, yes, but for tonight, they were part of his life, and he was not entirely sure how he felt about that. Sleep came slowly for Elias. He lay on his bed, listening to the storm, thinking of the quiet life he had always known. He had never considered sharing it with anyone. Yet now, with these 2 women in his cabin, he realized that life could be different. There was a fragility to their presence, a reminder that the world could change in an instant, and that sometimes people could enter one's life uninvited but not unwelcome. The hours passed, and eventually the storm began to subside. The wind slowed and the snow fell more gently, covering the forest in a soft white blanket. Elias woke early to check on the women. They were still asleep, peaceful at last, and he felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was not love, not yet, but something similar, a feeling that he had a duty to care for them, a responsibility he had never experienced before. Morning came, and with it the first light glinting off the snow. The cabin looked different now, alive with the presence of the 2 women. Elias prepared breakfast, simple porridge and tea, and watched as they awoke, blinking at the sunlight streaming through the windows. There was a quiet sense of relief on their faces. They had survived the night, and in this small, simple cabin they had found safety. Martha and Clara spoke softly over breakfast, thanking Elias once again. He nodded, accepting their gratitude without fuss. There was no need for grand words. The actions of sheltering, sharing warmth, and providing safety were enough. The bond between them was quiet, but growing, like a seed planted in fertile soil, waiting to grow with time. By mid-morning, the storm had fully passed. The mountain paths were still treacherous, but the world outside seemed peaceful, untouched, and full of potential. Elias knew that this day would mark a turning point in his life. His solitude had been interrupted, yes, but in its place was a new possibility. Companionship, connection, and the beginning of an unexpected journey with two women who had appeared at his doorstep in the middle of a storm. As he looked out over the snow-covered mountains, Elias realized that life, even in the quietest corners, had a way of surprising those who thought they were alone. The story of the mountain man who never had a wife was about to take a new turn, and the calm, predictable life he had built was about to become something richer, warmer, and more complicated than he had ever imagined. The days that followed the storm were unlike any Elias had ever known. His quiet, orderly life had been interrupted by the presence of Martha and Clara, and while he welcomed them into his cabin, living together proved to be more complicated than he had imagined. At first, the small space felt crowded. The three of them had to adjust to one another's habits, routines, and personalities. Elias, who had spent decades alone, found that his carefully measured life now required compromise, patience, and understanding, things he had seldom needed before. Elias noticed the little things immediately. Martha liked to talk while she worked, humming softly as she tidied the cabin or arranged the few possessions she had brought. Clara, on the other hand, moved quietly, almost like a shadow, preferring to observe rather than speak. Elias himself had always lived in silence, and at first the sounds of conversation, even soft, filled him with unease. But he reminded himself that these were not disruptions. They were signs of life, proof that the cabin was no longer just his. The first challenge came with chores. Elias had his own way of doing things, honed over years of solitude. Firewood was stacked neatly by size, the stove cleaned at precise intervals, and the garden tended with careful hands. Martha, eager to help, would rearrange things or suggest different methods. "I think it would be easier if we stacked the wood this way," she said one morning, moving logs from one pile to another. Elias watched her, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He had done it his way for decades, and change was not easy. Yet he reminded himself that this was part of sharing his life with others. Clara, in contrast, was hesitant to do anything without being asked. She would wait patiently for instructions, afraid of making mistakes in a household that had never had room for more than one person. Elias found himself giving small directions, and sometimes he noticed her smile when he praised her efforts. It was a strange sensation, being in a position to guide someone rather than simply living for himself. He realized that his heart, which he thought had grown accustomed to solitude, was capable of small joys he had never known before. Meals became another area of adjustment. Elias was used to eating simply. A bowl of porridge in the morning, vegetables from his garden, and sometimes bread or dried fruits. Martha and Clara, though grateful for every meal, preferred a little more variety. They would suggest herbs, different cooking methods, or even baking small breads over the stove. Elias tried to accommodate them, though he found himself occasionally clumsy in the kitchen when trying new methods. Yet there was laughter in those moments, light, unexpected, and a sound that Elias realized had been missing from his life for decades. Evenings were particularly challenging. Elias liked to sit by the fire, reading or reflecting on the day in silence. Now Martha and Clara would talk quietly, sharing stories of their past lives, the villages they had come from, and memories of their late husbands. At first, Elias felt awkward, unsure how to join the conversation, but over time he began to speak in small ways, sharing stories of his own childhood in the mountains, the adventures he had when he was young, and the little lessons he had learned from living alone. The women listened with interest, sometimes asking questions, and sometimes simply nodding, absorbing his words like sunlight warming the cold cabin. There were also moments of frustration. Martha's curiosity sometimes clashed with Elias's careful routines, and Clara's quiet hesitations occasionally caused delays or misunderstandings. Elias, who had spent years avoiding conflict, found himself learning patience in ways he had never expected. He realized that living with others required not only giving but also accepting imperfection. The cabin was no longer a place of perfect order. It was alive, messy in small ways, and full of the rhythms of human life. As the days turned into weeks, a rhythm began to emerge. Elias discovered that he enjoyed the companionship, even in small doses. He liked seeing Martha and Clara work together, the way they supported one another. He enjoyed the stories they shared, the laughter that sometimes erupted over small accidents, and even the quiet moments of reflection that they shared in silence. The cabin, once a place of absolute solitude, had become a home. It was warmer, not just from the fire, but from the presence of these two women who had entered his life so unexpectedly. Elias also began to notice changes in himself. He found himself thinking about the women when they were not around, wondering if they were safe, comfortable, and happy. He noticed little gestures he hadn't done in years, gathering extra firewood to ensure they were warm, preparing an extra portion of porridge, or keeping an eye on the garden so that fresh vegetables would be ready for them. These small acts of care were not burdensome, they were natural, almost instinctive, and they surprised him. He had thought his heart was satisfied with solitude, but now he realized that caring for others could bring a different kind of fulfillment. Martha and Clara also began to adapt. Martha learned the rhythms of the mountain, following Elias's example in tending the garden and chopping wood. She began to anticipate his routines, offering to help without being asked. Clara grew more confident, learning the small details of cabin life and contributing in her quiet, thoughtful way. Together, the two women brought energy and life to the cabin, balancing Elias's steadiness with their warmth and curiosity. Yet, beneath the surface, there were quiet moments of reflection for all three. Each of them had experienced loss, hardship, and fear before arriving at this cabin. Elias had lived decades alone, and Martha and Clara had been widowed and displaced. Living together forced them to confront their fears: the fear of losing control, the fear of being vulnerable, and the fear of trusting someone after so much pain. The cabin, once a place of refuge for Elias, had now become a place of emotional growth for all three. One particularly cold evening, a disagreement arose over the use of firewood. Martha wanted to use some wood to warm the small garden shed where she planned to dry herbs, while Elias insisted that all wood be reserved for the stove. Voices were raised, though not harshly, and for a moment tension filled the cabin. Then Clara, quietly but firmly, suggested a compromise. They would use part of the wood for the stove and part for the shed, carefully rationing it so that both needs were met. Elias and Martha looked at her, surprised by her wisdom. It was a small victory, but it symbolized the growth of cooperation and understanding that was slowly taking root in their lives. The days were not always easy, but they were filled with lessons. Elias learned that living with others required flexibility, patience, and humility. Martha learned that independence could coexist with trust, and Clara learned that quiet courage could change a household in subtle but meaningful ways. Together they discovered the joys of small victories, the comfort of shared routines, and the warmth of companionship that was both unexpected and deeply satisfying. Winter deepened, and with it came long nights and cold mornings. The snow outside made travel difficult, isolating them further from the village. Yet, this isolation no longer felt burdensome. The cabin was full of life, laughter, and conversation. Elias discovered that he could feel connected even in the smallest of gestures: a shared cup of tea, a warm blanket, or a quiet story told by the fire. For the first time in decades, he realized that life could be richer when shared. One morning, Elias found Martha and Clara working together to prepare breakfast. Martha hummed softly while rolling dough, and Clara carefully measured ingredients for a simple bread. The sight warmed his heart. This was a scene he had never imagined, yet it felt natural and right. He joined them quietly, helping with small tasks, and for the first time he felt that his life, which had been complete in solitude, had now grown fuller with shared purpose. By the end of the week, a new rhythm had fully emerged. Elias's cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. There was warmth in the air, not just from the fire, but from laughter, care, and the growing bond between the three of them. Each day brought small challenges and small triumphs, but together they navigated them with patience, understanding, and quiet joy. The mountain, once a place of solitude, had become a place of connection, growth, and unexpected happiness. Elias realized that life had a way of surprising even those who believed they were content. He had never imagined sharing his world with anyone, yet now he found comfort, joy, and even a quiet sense of excitement in the presence of Martha and Clara. He understood, in a way he never had before, that companionship was not just about love or romance. It was about trust, care, and shared experiences that made life richer and more meaningful. And so the mountain man who had never had a wife began to embrace the quiet transformations taking place in his cabin. His solitude was no longer a shield. It was now a foundation upon which new relationships could grow. Each day brought laughter, small challenges, and moments of reflection. The cabin, once a place of ordered calm, had become a living, breathing home, a space of warmth, cooperation, and human connection. Elias, Martha, and Clara had learned, slowly but surely, that the journey of living together was not without its difficulties, but it was also filled with rewards far greater than solitude alone could offer. And as they sat together one evening, watching the snow fall gently outside the window, Elias realized that life, even in the quietest, most remote corners of the world, could surprise a lonely heart with the warmth of shared living, the joy of companionship, and the quiet promise of something new. Winter had settled over the mountains, heavier and colder than any Elias had experienced in years. Snow covered the peaks and valleys in thick white blankets, making the familiar trails treacherous and almost invisible. The wind howled through the trees, and the once simple cabin now felt like a small fortress against the elements. Elias had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of daily life with Martha and Clara, Yet this stormy season promised a challenge that would test them all in ways they could never have imagined. It began one late afternoon when Elias noticed the clouds darkening quickly over the mountains. The sky turned a deep gray, and the wind began to whip against the cabin walls with a strength that rattled the windows. Snowflakes fell steadily at first, then thickened into dense sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The women were inside helping him prepare for the coming storm. Martha was tending the fire while Clara gathered supplies: water, dried herbs, and extra blankets. Elias worked alongside them, stacking firewood carefully and checking the stove. There was a quiet tension in the air, a shared understanding that this storm would be unlike any they had faced together. By evening, the snow had piled high against the cabin walls, and the world outside was almost completely hidden under a heavy white blanket. The wind shrieked as it rushed through the trees, shaking branches and sending occasional drifts of snow crashing down from the cliffs above. Elias looked out the window, his heart tightening. The paths that led to the village were impassable, and even he, who had lived in the mountains for decades, understood the danger this posed. They were trapped, entirely at the mercy of the storm. The night fell fast and dark, and with it came a creeping anxiety. The storm was relentless, and small problems in the cabin began to appear. The fire, no matter how carefully tended, threatened to burn too quickly, consuming precious wood. Snow seeped through a small crack in the roof, forming a thin layer on the floor near the corner. Elias moved swiftly to block it with spare cloth, while Martha and Clara helped, holding buckets to catch the melting snow. Despite the chaos outside, there was a sense of purpose within the cabin. Each of them worked together silently, communicating without words, aware that cooperation was their only hope of comfort and safety. As the hours dragged on, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Elias realized that the small stove, their lifeline against the freezing cold, might not be enough if the night continued much longer. He made the decision to venture briefly outside, only enough to reinforce the cabin with additional logs from the small woodpile nearby. He looked at Martha and Clara, seeing both fear and trust in their eyes. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "Don't move from the fire. I'll be quick." They nodded, understanding the risk he was taking. Elias wrapped himself in his thickest coat and stepped into the storm, the wind immediately biting at his face and snow blinding his eyes. Every step was a struggle, the deep snow threatening to pull him down with each movement. Inside, Martha and Clara waited anxiously. They could hear Elias moving outside, the crunch of snow under his boots faintly audible through the howling wind. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped herself in an extra blanket, while Martha whispered softly, as if speaking to calm both herself and the storm. "He's careful," Martha said. "He knows what he's doing." But even as she spoke, worry clutched her heart. The mountains were unforgiving, and they all knew that one misstep could have serious consequences. After what felt like an eternity, Elias returned, leaning against the cabin for support, breathless and covered in snow. "We're safe for now," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed the seriousness of the situation. The women helped him inside, brushing snow from his coat and wrapping him in blankets. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to feel a deep appreciation for their concern, realizing that he had begun to value their presence in ways he could not fully express. The storm raged through the night, and sleep came fitfully, if at all. Elias and the women took turns tending the fire, fetching water, and keeping an eye on the roof for any leaks. They spoke sparingly, conserving energy and warmth, but their shared presence created a bond that words could not fully capture. They discovered strengths in each other they had not known existed. Martha's calmness in moments of panic grounded them all. Clara's attentiveness prevented small problems from becoming larger ones, and Elias's knowledge of the mountains guided every decision. Together they became a single unit, working toward survival without complaint or fear. By the following morning, the storm had slowed but not ended. The snow outside was deep and pristine, covering the trees and rocks in smooth white layers. Elias stepped outside to survey the landscape. The cabin stood firm, a small island of warmth in a frozen world, but the mountain paths were completely blocked. Travel was impossible, and they were now entirely dependent on one another for both safety and sustenance. Elias returned inside, a mixture of relief and concern in his eyes. "We'll stay here a few more days," he said. "We can't risk going down yet." The days that followed were filled with quiet teamwork and small victories. They dug paths through the snow to collect firewood, melted snow for water, and prepared simple meals from preserved vegetables and grains. Elias taught the women how to recognize safe spots for wood and how to read the subtle signs of approaching storms. Martha and Clara contributed in ways that were both practical and emotional, keeping spirits high with stories, songs, and gentle humor. Life in the cabin was challenging, yet it was also rich with shared purpose. It was during one of these days that an unexpected moment of crisis arose, one that would forever deepen the bond between them. Clara, while fetching firewood near the edge of a steep slope, slipped slightly on the icy ground. She did not fall, but the scare was enough to make her heart race and send a jolt of panic through Elias and Martha. Elias ran to her immediately, checking her carefully for any injury, while Martha held her hand, speaking soothingly. The incident was minor, yet it reminded them all of the dangers surrounding them. In that moment, Elias realized how deeply he had begun to care for these women, not just as guests, but as companions whose safety mattered more to him than his own comfort. That evening, after the sun had dipped behind the mountains and the sky had turned shades of pink and orange, they sat together near the fire. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the stove and the soft sounds of the women's breathing. Elias reflected on the events of the past days. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion together, and they had survived. But more importantly, they had learned to trust one another, to work as a team, and to care deeply for each other's well-being. For Elias, this was a revelation. He had always believed that solitude was enough for happiness, yet now he saw that connection could bring a joy he had never known. Martha broke the silence. "I never imagined a place like this could feel like home," she said softly, her voice carrying gratitude and wonder. Clara nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We've been through so much," she whispered. "But here, together, it feels safe. It feels right." Elias looked at them both, a quiet warmth spreading through his chest. He realized that the cabin, which had once been a sanctuary of solitude, had transformed into something far more meaningful, a place of shared trust, care, and quiet love. As the days passed, the storm finally began to ease. The sun returned, casting golden light on the snowy landscape and melting the heaviest drifts. Paths would soon be clear and travel to the village would again be possible. Yet none of them were eager to leave. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It had become a symbol of what they had built together. Elias found himself thinking of the women even when he was alone, noticing their absence in ways he had never experienced before. Martha and Clara, too, had begun to see Elias, not just as a helper, but as a person whose steady strength and quiet kindness had become central to their lives. Through the storm, they had discovered more than survival skills. They had discovered patience, trust, and a new understanding of one another. Elias realized that his heart, once closed and content with solitude, had begun to open in ways he could not have anticipated. He felt gratitude, warmth, and even a flicker of hope. A hope that life, despite its challenges, could be shared, enjoyed, and enriched by the presence of those we care for. The experience left an imprint on all three of them. Each had faced fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion, yet they had emerged stronger, closer, and more aware of the value of companionship. Elias, who had once believed that life was complete without another person, now understood that connection could bring meaning beyond what solitude could offer. Martha and Clara, who had feared the cold and isolation of the mountains, discovered resilience, courage, and trust in themselves and in Elias. As the sun rose one morning, casting long shadows across the snow, Elias looked at the women and smiled quietly to himself. They had survived the storm together, and in doing so they had created a bond that would last far beyond the winter. For the first time in his life, Elias felt that his story, the story of a man who never had a wife, was entering a new chapter, one filled not with loneliness, but with the quiet promise of companionship, shared struggles, and the warmth of hearts united in trust and care. The snow glistened like a blanket of diamonds under the morning sun. The trees were dusted with frost, and the air smelled crisp and pure, carrying the faint scent of pine and melting snow. Elias stepped outside his cabin, inhaling the cold, clean air, feeling the warmth of the fire still lingering in his chest. The past days had been long, difficult, and yet transformative. He looked at Martha and Clara, who were quietly sweeping the porch and arranging firewood, and felt a sense of wonder. Life had shifted in ways he had never imagined, and it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, had become a home filled with laughter, conversation, and shared routines. Elias watched as Martha carefully placed freshly cleaned dishes on the table, her movements precise and graceful. Clara was tending a small basket of herbs, trimming the leaves and organizing them for drying. The sight was comforting, almost magical, in its ordinary beauty. Elias realized that this small, simple life shared with others had grown richer, warmer, and more meaningful than he could have anticipated. Over the next days, the three of them ventured cautiously down the mountain, clearing small paths and testing the snow-covered trails. Each step was careful, measured, and deliberate. They gathered what they needed from the village, flour, a few vegetables, and other essentials, but each journey reminded Elias of the bond they shared. It was no longer just survival, it was cooperation, trust, and shared joy. Martha and Clara had become more than guests. They were companions, friends, and partners in a life that had previously been quiet and lonely. One afternoon, as they returned from the village with a small bundle of supplies, Elias stopped to look at the mountains stretching endlessly before them. He felt a profound sense of peace. The cabin, the snow, the trees, and the cold wind, all of it had been a part of his life for decades, but it had never felt quite so alive. He turned to the women, who were smiling despite the chill, and realized that this shared existence had transformed him. He had always believed that his solitude was enough, that he was content with the life he had built alone. Yet now he understood that true contentment could include others, that connection could bring a depth of happiness that solitude alone never could. Back at the cabin, they settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were spent tending the garden, chopping wood, and preparing meals together. Afternoons were for rest, reading, and sharing stories of the past. Evenings were the most cherished, sitting around the fire as snow fell softly outside, telling tales, singing quietly, or simply enjoying the silence of togetherness. Elias noticed how natural it felt to include the women in every part of his day. There was no awkwardness, no intrusion, just the gentle flow of shared life. The changes were not only practical but emotional. Elias found himself more patient, kinder, and willing to express care in ways he had never imagined. He would wake early to fetch fresh water for tea, lay extra blankets by the fire, or prepare breakfast before the women were awake. These were small acts, but they carried a significance he had never understood in his years of solitude. He realized that love, in its quietest form, could be shown through attention, thoughtfulness, and shared responsibility. Martha and Clara, in turn, flourished in this environment. Martha's confidence grew as she learned the ways of the mountain, mastering chores and planning meals that added variety to their simple life. Clara's quiet strength became evident in small but meaningful ways, organizing supplies, caring for the fire, and offering comfort when Elias or Martha felt weary. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, now reflected their shared effort, care, and resilience. Each of them had found a place where they belonged, a life that was no longer solitary but shared and meaningful. One evening, after a long day of work and exploration, they sat together by the fire, the glow of the flames reflecting in their eyes. Elias realized that he had grown attached to their presence in a way that went beyond friendship. There was a quiet warmth, a sense of family and home, that filled the cabin with life. He looked at Martha and Clara, noting the trust in their eyes, the way they leaned on one another, and the way they had slowly become a part of his heart. For the first time, he admitted to himself that life could be richer with companionship, and that solitude, while comforting, was not the only path to contentment. Days turned into weeks, and the cabin became a place of stability, safety, and growth. Elias began to share more stories from his past, tales of childhood adventures in the mountains, the lessons he had learned while living alone, and memories of moments that had shaped him. The women listened attentively, asking questions, laughing at his anecdotes, and occasionally teasing him gently. This exchange of stories created a bond that went beyond necessity. It was a connection built on understanding, respect, and shared experience. The seasons began to change, and with them, new opportunities emerged. Spring brought fresh growth to the garden, the return of birds, and the melting of the snow. The cabin, once buried under the weight of winter, now stood surrounded by green shoots and budding flowers. Elias, Martha, and Clara embraced the new season with enthusiasm. They planted vegetables, gathered herbs, and explored the forest together. Life had become an adventure again, not of solitude, but of shared discovery. Elias noticed a subtle transformation within himself. He felt a lightness of spirit he had not known in decades. His heart, which had once been satisfied with the quiet rhythms of solitary life, now carried a warmth that came from shared laughter, mutual care, and companionship. He realized that he no longer dreaded the future alone, that he looked forward to each day with the women by his side. Life, he understood, was not just about surviving. It was about experiencing, caring, and growing together. Martha and Clara also discovered new aspects of themselves. Martha's independence, once a shield against hardship, became a source of strength that contributed to the household. Clara's quiet courage, once hidden, became evident in her careful planning, her attention to detail, and her gentle guidance during challenging moments. Together, they formed a harmonious team, each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. Their bond with Elias was not just functional, it was emotional, built on trust, respect, and shared experiences. One morning, Elias found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. He thought about the storm that had introduced the women to his life, the challenges of living together, and the moments of fear, courage, and cooperation they had shared. Each experience had shaped not only their bond, but also his understanding of life. He realized that his long years of solitude had not been wasted. They had prepared him for this moment, for the ability to welcome others into his life with patience, care, and openness. As the days passed, Elias, Martha, and Clara continued to create a life together that was full, meaningful, and balanced. There was laughter, quiet reflection, and the occasional disagreement, but all were resolved with patience and understanding. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a home, a place where hearts could connect, grow, and heal. Elias had discovered that companionship did not diminish his life. It enriched it. By the end of the season, Elias could see the transformation clearly. The mountain that had once symbolized solitude now symbolized home, connection, and shared life. The cabin, the fire, the garden, and the snow-covered peaks were no longer just parts of his solitary existence. They were part of a shared story, a narrative that included trust, care, and love. Elias understood at last that life could be both peaceful and full, solitary and connected, quiet and meaningful. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, the sun setting behind the peaks in a blaze of color, Elias spoke quietly. "I never imagined life could feel like this," he said, looking at Martha and Clara. "I never thought I would share my days with anyone. Yet now, it feels right. It feels like home." Martha smiled, reaching out to place a hand over his. Clara, leaning slightly against the chair, nodded. There was no need for grand declarations. Everything they felt was understood in the warmth of the fire, the quiet exchange of glances, and the steady rhythm of shared life. Elias had finally realized that he did not need a wife to complete his life. What he needed was connection, trust, and the shared experiences that make life meaningful. With Martha and Clara by his side, he had discovered a family of choice, a home built not just from wood and stone, but from care, understanding, and love. His solitude had been transformed, not erased, but enriched, giving him a life far fuller than he had ever dreamed possible. As the stars appeared one by one in the clear night sky, Elias looked out the window and smiled quietly. The mountains, the cabin, and the life he had built were no longer solitary. They were shared. And in that sharing, he had found a peace deeper than solitude alone could provide, a joy born from trust, friendship, and the quiet promise of each day spent together. The story of the mountain man who never had a wife had reached its final chapter, not in loneliness, but in companionship, warmth, and the rich tapestry of life shared with those who had once begged for shelter and now had become family.